At the suggestion of Pastor Tom, we did something different at the Harry Hayday's event this year than we have normally done in the past several years. We had a prayer booth, and I was going to have some pictures for you, but my computer wasn't cooperating. So you're just going to have to imagine what that booth looked like. We had a big sign that says, "Need prayer? We'll gladly pray for you." We had a booth full of Bibles and some other information. If you don't know what Harry Hayday's is, it's the annual parade and event in Grandview. The website calls it a celebration of Harry Truman's birthday and legacy. Harry Truman was a president of the United States and spent part of his life here in Grandview. And if you haven't been there, the whole street is shut down. Main Street is shut down. And there's food and business vendors all through the street. And organizations and churches can also participate, which is what we've done the last 3 or 4 years, I think. But this year we did a little something different. We had a prayer booth, and we prayed for over 50 people. Can you imagine that there were that many people who were willing and wanted us to pray for them? And many of them, you could tell, were not believers. In fact, many of the ladies helping us out in prayer would ask them, do you know Jesus Christ? Before they even asked them about what to pray for them about. And so we had all these people who were hurting and dealing with some difficulties and received prayer. And at that event, we not only prayed for people, but we encouraged people to pray for Grandview, the city, as well. And we gave out little bookmarks that had a QR code, which would take you to our church website, a page on the church website, that gave you all kinds of ways intentionally to pray for Grandview. And we gave out prayer bracelets that say, "Pray for Grandview" as well, asking people to pray. And if you were here several weeks ago, everyone received one of those little bookmarks. And on that bookmark is a verse from the passage that we've been working with last week and this week. We're going to work with it again some. Jeremiah 29:7. Part of the message to the exiles who are in Babylon, we shared with the people as encouragement to pray. And we're going to look at that verse here in a moment and what it says, but it's directed to these exiles in Babylon. Now, we're not in captivity. We haven't been carried off into a foreign land where we don't know the language, culture, the customs, or the religion, or anything else going on. We're not in exile in that way. But what is stated, or the message given to these exiles, is helpful to us for a couple reasons. The Bible encourages us to think about ourselves as God's people, as sojourners on this earth, as foreigners and strangers on earth, Hebrews 11:3. That our citizenship is in heaven, Philippians 3:20. And like Abraham, we're looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God. So that's one reason why this content given to exiles can be helpful for us, because this too is not our home. A second reason that this can be helpful to us is that some suggest, including one of our own general superintendents, that the church in America is in a sense living in exile. Here's what Scott Daniels says. People who live in exile feel displaced. They feel like resident aliens. They feel like a people who have to live counterculturally. I quoted that last week, but we're doing it again because we're in the same passage. Who have to live counterculturally. So the question that we began to answer last week, or to ask, is, so if we are living in exile in that sense, how do we live as God's people in this world? We find our text in Jeremiah 29, verses 1 through 9, again this morning, but we're going to focus on verse 7 today. This is the word of the Lord. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests. And I learned this week, did you know Ezekiel was one of those priests? The prophet Ezekiel, he was a priest who was called to be a prophet. He was among those priests, among the exiles. The prophets and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried off into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This was after King Jehoiachin and the queen mother and the court officials and the leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the craftsmen and the artisans had gone into exile from Jerusalem. He entrusted the letter to Elisha, the son of Shaphan, and to Gemariah, the son of Hilkiah, whom Zedekiah, king of Judah, sent to King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And this is what the letter said. Remember now, this is written to exiles in a foreign place. Everything's completely different. This is what they're told to do while they live in exile. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there and do not decrease. And that's what we covered last week. Verse 7 is what we're going to cover this week. And also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. The word of the Lord. Again, Jeremiah is writing to these exiles who were carried off in 597. That's about 10 years before the actual fall of Judah and Jerusalem that comes later in 587. It's one of two, Dennis Bratcher says, one of two major deportations of Israelites to Babylon that comprise what we call the exiles. And according to 2 Kings 22 and noted in verse 2, King Jehoiachin, his mother, all the officials, the artisans, all these people, about 10,000 people, were carried off into captivity. And that's who Jeremiah is writing to. And in Jeremiah's letter, he makes it very clear that this isn't going to be a short-lived time in exile in Babylon. That's completely contrary to what the false prophets were saying, especially Hananiah. Remember, we said a little bit last week in chapter 28. He was saying, within 2 years, you're going to be back home. Don't worry about all this exile stuff. Don't listen to what Jeremiah is saying about build plants and houses and all that. Don't worry about it. You're going to be back home soon. Jeremiah says, no, the Lord says you're going to be there a while. Verse 10 says 70 years. So he's telling them, he's instructing them what they need to do and how they are supposed to live as God's people in exile. And we pick up on his instruction now in verse 7. Listen to what it says. And I think this might be among the most difficult parts of the instruction that these exiles are given. Listen to what it says. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I've carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. You see why this might be difficult? They're being asked to seek the peace and prosperity of their oppressors, the one who carried them off into exile. They are in a place where they are unwanted outsiders, and they're being asked for God to pray that God would bless that city and their captors. You see how that would be difficult to do? Alex Verghese explains their dilemma further. The exiled Judeans are to work toward promoting shalom in the city in which they live. They must carry out this task. Listen, this is why it would be hard. While living in submission to foreign domination. This shalom does not come through violence or anti-government activities. Instead, they're to build homes, establish family life, engage in the normal activities of life. This shalom also does not come through isolation from the larger community, but through the fulfillment of their civic responsibility in the city that is hostile to their existence. Now listen, this is another reason why this would be so difficult. The exiles must not resent or hate their captors. That's the only way you could pray for them. They are not to hate or resent their captors for uprooting them from their homeland and planting them in a foreign city, but instead they must work and pray for the peace and prosperity of the city. Do you see why that would be a difficult instruction and command to follow? Think about that. It would require hearts free from bitterness and resentment toward their captors. And that's probably not their first inclination or ours. In addition, they're to make intentional efforts on the behalf of the city for its good. So it's not just, okay, I hope everything goes okay. No, they are intentionally to do things that would be on the behalf of and for the good of the city. And that means they can't isolate themselves and say, I'm just going to pretend that whole outside world doesn't exist. I'm going to isolate myself from it. No, they are to work, did you hear? Work for the peace and prosperity of the city. Here's how a couple of the other translations put it. The New Living Translation, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city. The CEV, work hard to make it prosperous. And that would make a positive impact on their own lives as well. That's part of the promise given. It's clear then that the peace and prosperity of the city means more than the absence of strife and violence or stirring up trouble. It includes that, but it's more than just that. In fact, the word is used 3 times in our text in verse 7 alone. The word peace, it is the Hebrew word shalom. It's translated prosperity here, peace here, welfare. But there isn't really an English word that captures the entire meaning of the word shalom. There's no English equivalent that captures the entire meaning. So what the NIV does, it adds peace and prosperity to try to capture the full meaning of the word, but it doesn't even capture the entire meaning. It is a overall, Donna Wiseman says, shalom is the overall welfare, the wholesomeness in every respect, physical, moral, and spiritual of the city. And that's what all these exiles are supposed to work for, give themselves to, listen, truly desire for the city and pray for. David has a comment he wants to interject, I think.
Psalm 137, first 6 verses.
Yeah, don't read the 7th. Yeah, David is referring to one of the prayers of the exiles in Babylon, and they didn't have the right heart yet because they were asking God to bash the heads of the babies on the ground, their captors and oppressors. That's what their real heart was. That's what they would have to deal with, the bitterness and resentment and hatred, and we could understand that. But now they're being called to pray for this city, for their captors, for God to bless them and to deal with all that heart stuff. Be hard, wouldn't it? It's the equivalent of what Jesus teaches in Matthew 5. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be called children of your Father in heaven. That would be easy. That would not be easy. But this is all the more reason to pray. That's the only way, is reliance on the Lord. The only way to navigate through exile is to rely on Him and to trust Him. And that's why they're called to pray. But they're also not just meant to limp through the exile. They're actually meant to be God's people and the witness, even in that forsaken place. At least that's what they feel like, forsaken. So take this in a little bit. They're taken from their land. Later on, they learn that their temple is destroyed. Their homes are burned with fire. All of that loss, all of that terrible distress. And they're asked to pray for the people who did that. But actually, the call to pray is good news, because it means that God still hears their prayer while they're in exile. They've been taken from their homeland and from the temple that's been destroyed. They may have thought, well, God has just abandoned us here. No, the call to prayer means that God will hear their prayers, even in exile. So prayer is one of the ways to live in exile until the promises of God come to fruition. It is a way to navigate through all of those difficulties until the promises of restoration come to fruition. And remember, those promises of restoration will continue to pop up through here. In fact, in verses 10 through 14, they're given again. But until that time, remember, it's going to be 70 years. Until that time, how are you going to live in this foreign land, in exile, where everything's lost? You don't have your own kings. How are you going to live? In prayer, seeking the peace and prosperity, the shalom of the city. That's how you are to live, they're told. Let me give you an example, and I had David read an extended passage from Daniel 2, because Daniel is in exile in Judah during King Nebuchadnezzar's reign. The person that God used to send these exiles into exile. And David is an example of someone who is faithfully living for the prosperity and peace of the city in which he lives, and is doing so through prayer. Did you hear the account that David read this morning? He is an example of that courageous faithfulness and perseverance through prayer, even in exile. Let me just highlight some of that account this morning as an example. He is forced to serve King Nebuchadnezzar. He and his friends are put through an extensive training program where they have to learn the language and culture of the Babylonians. And they are put in service to the king. And by the end of that training, in about 3 years, they are 10 times better than all the magicians, enchanters, and sorcerers of Babylon. 10 times better in all wisdom and knowledge. Then in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this troubling dream, and he doesn't know what it means. And he asks all his wise men, all the sorcerers, all the enchanters, all the people who are supposed to know what this all means, and they can't do it. They can't give him the meaning. And so he is thrown into a violent rage, and he's going to kill all of them, these so-called wise men. The problem is that includes Daniel and his friends. And Arioch, the king's executioner, comes looking for Daniel to do his job. And Daniel asks, well, why is this matter so urgent? Why is the king wanting to do this? And he explains the situation. And Daniel says, please, I'll give the king his interpretation. Just give me some time. And he goes back to his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. You might know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He goes back to them and says, we need to pray now. You see what he's doing? He's navigating through prayer. He was able to courageously ask for more time. And they spend time in prayer. And that night, thankfully, the Lord didn't wait too long to answer their prayer. And he gives Daniel the dream and its meaning and a vision of the night. And did you hear Daniel's wonderful prayer? David was blessed by it this morning when it was read. Did you hear the prayer? Daniel cries out to the Lord, and he blesses God in gratitude, and he says, praise be to the name of God forever and ever. Wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons. He deposes kings and raises others up. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to the discerning. Then he goes on to say, listen, you have given me wisdom and power. You have made known to me what we asked of you. You have made known to us the dream of the king. So in exile, Daniel is an example. He is praying to the Lord, and the Lord answers his prayer. Just as the exiles that Jeremiah is writing to, telling them to pray, it means that the Lord is going to hear and answer their prayers for the peace and prosperity of the city. If they will give themselves to that, the Lord is going to work through this community of exiles that nobody wants to be there, and he's going to use them to bless even that place. Daniel's an example. I told Liz and Myrna this morning I might go a little shorter because of the heat in here, but here, let me show you what you can do. In camp meeting, that bulletin can serve a double purpose. You can wave it like this in your face, or move a little closer to the vents. I might go a little short this morning. But Daniel and his friends as well, if you read on in Daniel, they're also examples of courageous faithfulness, even in exile. Daniel as well. The Lord hears and answers their prayer and gives them the necessary courage in the face of the king's edict. And so the other exiles are called to do the same, to live faithfully, prayerfully, and courageously, just as Daniel models. Alex Verghese says the exiles' total involvement in the city, in the life of the city through their work and prayer would have a positive effect on their lives. It would also have a far-reaching effect on all those who live in the city. So the question is for us is, in our own time of exile, I know it's a different sense of the word, but in our own time of having to live counterculturally to the world all around us, is it marked by prayer and courageous faithfulness as God's people? That's how they're being called to live in verse 7. So in our own time of living in this world as God's people, is it marked by prayer and courageous faithfulness through the grace of God as his people? The Babylonian exiles are called to respond in that way by the Lord. J.A. Thompson says such advice would not have been easy to accept for the people who had been carried off from their homeland, but by those whom Jeremiah was asking them to pray for. But listen, any other approach would result in deep resentment. You know what the teens brought up in Sunday school? It would also mean that they would be disobeying the Lord. And that's what got them in exile in the first place. It would mean that they would believe the false hope of the false prophets that this was going to be over in a few years. So what about now? Can God's people still make a far-reaching impact on the city? And the answer is yes. And verse 7 gives us the blueprint. Here, verse 7 again. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city into which you've been carried into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. The same word shalom is translated prosper there twice and peace there once. Same word, the shalom of the city. We're given two ways. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city. What does that look like? I don't think the church overall in Gravy, not just this church, but I don't think there's a hostility towards the church in the community. I don't think that's true. But there might be some indifference to the church and to the gospel message. There might be some resistance for any number of reasons. But that won't improve. Did you hear what Verghese says? It isn't through isolation either. It doesn't mean we should let's huddle in here and then go back home and get into our garage and shut the door and go back in our homes and pretend the world around us doesn't exist. It won't get any better if we isolate ourselves. No, we're called to be God's people in this world. In the world, not of the world, but in the world. That applies to our own households and as a church. That's why I think the prayer booth, the things like that at the Harry Heydays is such a blessing. That's why I think the community garden that we're doing is such a blessing. Earlier it says plant gardens and eat what they produce. We're planting a garden, but it's all for the community. It's all given freely to the community. We aren't doing this so we can make a few extra bucks on the side. We're giving it all away freely as a visible sign of Christ's presence and love. And we are meeting people we would have never met otherwise and able to pray for them and meet them at their point of need. You see how that might promote the peace and prosperity of the city? In fact, inevitably, the people ask, how much is this? Thinking that there has to be some kind of give and take here. What's the catch? And we are able to say, no, this is a blessing we want to extend. The free produce and prayer is offered to each person and are given irrespective of the barriers that often divide people, political, racial, economic, or social. We give it all away freely. So you might not be able to go out in the garden, pull weeds, or water, or harvest. You might not even be able to get out to the distribution table to pray with people and give it away, but you can pray. In the packet this morning, in your bulletin, I've given you part of what we gave in the 24 hours of prayer for the garden and for Easter weekend, the last 24 hours of prayer. I've given that to you again in that prayer packet as ways to pray for that ministry. Even if we can't do anything else, we can pray. And I don't mean that as a last resort. Oh yeah, we can pray about it. No, I mean as something vitally important to do. And that leads into the second part here. I did cut out part of the sermon, by the way, Liz and Myrna. I cut out a whole story there. I saved us at least 3 minutes in this heat. The second part is, in verse 7, is to pray for the city. We don't have the same reservations we do that the exiles did about their Babylonian captors. We probably don't have that. I hope not. Hate and resentment for the city around us. We don't have that as they do. But do we want the peace and prosperity of Grandview, Missouri? And all that means for God's shalom. It's His wholeness in all these ways, spiritual, physical, moral, and all of that for the city. Do we want that? If not, that's a pretty good starting point for us to pray about. Lord, I don't have that heart for the city. I don't think I really even pray much about the city. It's not something I really intentionally think about. Lord, help me have your heart for the lost and broken people of Grandview. That's a pretty good starting point. Kind of like what Pastor Tom was talking about with our own prayer times with the Lord for ourselves. That can also be true when it comes to praying for the community, nation, and world. I told you there was a QR code on that bookmark. I'm well aware that some people can't access that to get to online. So in that prayer packet that I gave you in the bulletin is also most of what's online to intentionally pray for Grandview. Its leadership, the different organizations, the schools and all their principals, by name, all of that's in that prayer packet this morning. To take with you as a starting point. That's not exhaustive at all. That's just a kind of a starting point to help us pray for this city. Pray for the city of Grandview. And if you don't live here, that's okay. You go to church here. You're part of this congregation. If you don't live in Grandview, you can also pray for wherever you live and kind of adapt what I've given you to pray for Belton or Raymore or Pleasant Hill or wherever you live.